Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this first breakout panel here in 205. My name is Sven van Stichel. I'll be the MC for all sessions held in this room. Now the topic is Japan in the media. What should Japan's story be, and how should Japan communicate it? With us here today, we have the following panelists. We have Ms. Tamsin Booth, Tokyo Bureau Chief for The Economist. We have Ms. Fiona Chan, who's a Senior Economics Correspondent for the Straits Times, Singapore. We have Mr. Adrian Monk, who's Managing Director and Head of Public Engagement for the World Economic Forum. Ms. Yumiko Ono, who's Managing Editor for the Wall Street Journal, Japan. And our moderator for this session is Mr. Ross Robery, who's President and Representative Director for Edelman Japan. And now I'll leave the word to Mr. Robery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for attending. We've got a very full room here today. We have a very distinguished panel of senior journalists and communicators here today to delve into what should Japan's story be and how should it be telling it. I attended a presentation recently that talked about the 1964 Olympics and the preparations for those in 1962, 1963. And it was very evident that at that time, Japan had a very well-defined story. They had the bullet train running. It was a story of Japan coming back with excellent technology, was going to be a manufacturing power. So as we head into the 2020 Olympics, at least at this stage, I don't really think that we have as well a defined story. So we'd like to delve into that today and get some views not only from our panelists, but also from people in the audience. About 2 years ago, I think it was, I was talking to a journalist at one of the wire services, and he was complaining that if the word Japan was in the headlines of one of his articles, it automatically meant that the number of hits went down. That, I think, was the level of, unfortunately, the level of interest in Japan at the time. I have a very strong perception that things have changed greatly over the past year or so. And I'd first just like to ask our panelists, how have they seen interest in Japan change over the past months and year or so? And what sort of stories do your editors, do your readers are showing interest in? Perhaps Yumiko can hit off with you.
Sure. I'm Yumiko Ono. I'm the managing editor of the Wall Street Journal Japan, which is the Japanese language website for the Wall Street Journal. And as a person who's been in Japan for a while, one of the big things that has changed is Mr. Abe. I mean, think about it. Prime Minister Abe, Shinzo Abe, has been a word that was used in the Wall Street Journal since he took office at least 522 times? I think it's more now because I made that count on Friday. The person before that, Toshihiko Noda, 175 times in the 1 month, year and 6 months that he's been in office. So what does that say? I mean, I was talking to the bureau chief at the time, and who was saying, well, you know, in the past, what the Bloomberg reporter, or whoever it was that told you, it's true. Before, the prime ministers in Japan changed so often that it was sometimes confusing to our readers and editors to put the name of the prime minister right there in the lead. So what we would often do, just to make it easier for the reader, was to say the prime minister in the lead and put his name lower down in the story. But ever since Mr. Abe took office, and Abenomics is also a word that we put in our stories many times, Shinzo Abe is a word that we put in without hesitation in the lead because, you know, it resonates with readers. And that just goes to show how much more Japan is, you know, in the news and higher up in the level of interest among the Japanese readers, the world readers.
Thanks. I'd like to delve in later about the question is that can Japan's story exist without Mr. Abe? But let's talk about that later. Adrian.
I think if you look at, for example, the point made just a moment ago about the... Oh, hello, that's better. Sorry, my weedy voice boosted. About the importance of the Prime Minister in telling the story. Just as an example in Davos, it's not that we give people slots, but regularly the Japanese Prime Minister was a guest on Saturday in Davos, which is right at the end of the week, by which time a lot of folks have already started to pack up and move on. And in a sense, that sort of reflected where Japan was in the global story. The Japanese media who came with him were fascinated by whatever the Japanese Prime Minister had to tell everyone, but the rest of the global media had kind of packed their skis and headed out of Davos for the next thing. And this year, back in January, the Prime Minister headlined Davos. Really headlined it. He opened the show effectively, and we don't have a formal kind of opening ceremony or opening speech, if you like, but he was there on the Wednesday, right at the beginning. And I think that reflected two things. One, that Japan has a very interesting story now to tell in his premiership, which I think is fundamentally different to those that have come before it. And two, that Japan is seen, if you like, as a kind of post-industrial laboratory. It's facing all the issues that advanced industrial economies are facing, with both aging population. It went into so-called lost decades 20 years before the Eurozone, for example. It's got issues about empowerment that are contemporary with all advanced economies. So it's facing a lot of those same issues. How it tackles them is of interest, I think, globally. And it's interesting, I think, that the Prime Minister's been able to kind of galvanize attention in the way he has in the last year and a half. But I think what's more interesting in terms of telling Japan's story is, I think we're now at a point where we need more Japanese voices to fill that story out. I think the danger is that it becomes an Abe story and not a Japan story. And I think that's probably the next challenge that Japan faces.
Thank you, Fiona.
Thanks. I agree with the previous panelists speaking about how Mr. Abe has changed the direction of Japan's story. I think I will even go so far as to say that before that, the story about Japan's economy, and I cover regional economics, so I'm going to speak a bit more about the economic aspect, was that Japan was a cautionary tale, basically, of what happened when you closed your doors to immigration, when you looked inward and, slipped into a lost decade of deflation. But now Japan is an example of what happens when you have enough leadership to galvanize the entire economy, to change the story into one of how you move into, as I think Adrian put it, a post-industrial period where growth has slowed, you have an aging population, demographics are no longer the primary driver of your economic growth. And how Japan takes that forward is of great interest to everybody, especially in Asia, where even countries such as China and India are already beginning to see the demographic dividends slow down. And a lot of countries are dealing with immigration issues, not just Japan, but also in Britain, in the US, in Singapore, and Australia. And how Japan deals with the impact of focusing basically on domestic labor is something that everyone's looking at right now. So I think Japan has great potential to show leadership in these areas, economically as well as politically.
Thank you, Fiona.
Just on the point about renewed interest, I think that's absolutely right. I know that my predecessor, who covered the tragedy of 3/11, after incredible headlines on that, of course, he struggled to get stories in, and we cut our bureau in two not long ago. And of course now it's everyone wants all Abenomics all the time, which means a huge amount of work. Obviously, I'm longing for some reinforcements. I think that also carries the sort of the suddenness of that revival in interest does carry a sting in its tail, though, because I think that if Abenomics doesn't work, I think all of us in this room very much hope that it will, and many of us believe that it will. But I think that if it peters out, I think the drop in interest would, there's a risk that it would be even greater, and you would have still less interest in a story of genteel decline, which I guess was the status quo before Abe came back.
Thank you. Japan has a tendency to, at least in its marketing, to use celebrities to get the message across. And what often happens is the celebrity becomes the story rather than the product or the company they're trying to promote. From what the panelists have said, it sounds like there's a very strong element here that Abe-san, the spokesperson, has actually become the story. And Adrian raised the point that we need to have more Japanese voices needed to tell that story. So I'd like to throw out to the panelists, what do you think the story should be for Japan? And how do you think they should be telling it? Maybe we'll start with Adrian.
Well, thanks, Ross, pushing me right into that one. I think one of the ways probably that it's become very popular for governments looking to tell stories, and one I would heartily advise Japan not to go down the route of, is the kind of television channel route. You know, you can see in things like Russia Today and Al Jazeera, you know, looking to use 24-hour TV news as a kind of method to kind of push a government agenda. I think what you said about spokespeople is absolutely true. I mean, I think you do need more people out there to reflect the diversity of Japanese society and to reflect the diversity of the debate in Japanese society and to show people what that's like. But I think if you look at some of the traditional weapons, governments seem to prefer organs of the media that they can control or influence to the power of individuals, because those individuals are per se not controllable. And if you build them up, they might, God forbid, have independent opinions which don't necessarily correlate with those of the government at the same time. So I would say that, you know, Japan ought to be looking at finding the people who can help it tell its story in a way that, for example, in the cultural sphere, you've got a Lang Lang in China, you've got a Jack Ma kind of fronting for Chinese business. You know, you've got a range of different high-profile Chinese figures who are not necessarily seen to be parroting from a government rule book, but who are illustrating some of the complexity and depth of Chinese society. And I think in Japan, perhaps looking for some of those voices and taking steps to promote them with the attendant risk that they may not speak from a sort of prescripted government rule book is something that I think would be a great next step in telling Japan's story.
I think Yumiko wants to jump in, but can I just delve a little bit further than that? We've seen, for instance, Japanese participation at the World Economic Forum increase, I think, exponentially over the past 5-10 years. So are you saying that we need more, that those people need to be broadened out in terms? I think that we are seeing more voices on those sort of stages.
I think generally in terms of global engagement, you know, we need to be hearing more in sort of global, especially I would say still Anglophone media from diverse Japanese voices, because at the moment I don't think that diversity is there. I mean, certainly we've seen more of it in places like Davos, albeit drawn from principally a business and academic group. But I think if you think that Prime Minister Abe has created a wedge of interest, then you want a wedge to allow people to come in behind that behind that. And right now, I certainly don't know who those voices are and who those people are. And you know, if I don't, then I'm sure that goes for a lot of other equally poorly informed people across the world.
I'm sure you're not poorly informed, but Yumiko.
Ross, you said that Japan may not have a story, as clear a story to tell for coming, leading up to the next Olympics, but it has a lot of questions that it really must answer in order for Japan to remain in the news and remain in, as a country of interest to the rest of the world. And the economy, as you all mentioned, and what's going to happen to it, how is Japan going to keep going with its economy is a big one. The discussion downstairs talked about the third arrow being perhaps a very slow motion arrow, but there's got to be more people talking about, well, how is this arrow going to get even quicker? I mean, we have a separate editorial team that does op-eds, opinion pieces, and they're very critical of the third arrow, and they're having lots of fun talking about the invisible arrow or the many, many arrows or the 1,000 arrows or where is the arrow? So, you know, Japan could use some more people talking about at least what is the plan? You know, what does the government plan to do about the third arrow and try to make it move forward more quickly?
Interesting. I was on another panel with Fiona recently, in where we had a number of corporations from Japan and a panel of Asian journalists. And one of the things that came out of that was that corporations, companies also needed to be more engaging, particularly as they globalize. The point was made that Korean companies, Chinese companies are much more proactive in the way they communicate in overseas markets. And the point was raised that Japanese companies themselves have to do more to back up what's being done by the government. Fiona, perhaps you might elaborate.
That's right. It's absolutely true. I think part of it is a language barrier that still in the 21st century hasn't really gone away. A lot of releases or financial statements in English are released only a few days after the Japanese numbers come out, and that's obviously a great challenge for media who don't speak Japanese. I think that Japan's corporations are also, like the economy, going through a revival. So they're looking at a lot of areas where it's not very well publicized, but they're doing a lot of research in future technologies. For instance, Panasonic, we recently did a feature about them. So, you know, it's always been seen as a declining consumer electronics giant, but they're now looking at technologies, ways to turn their expertise into new avenues for growth. For instance, they're looking at building indoor gardens where they use LED lights to make sure that, you know, it becomes like a greenhouse the whole year round. And it's something that, you know, in Singapore we're very interested in because there's no space for farms the way there is in Japan or other places. And as cities become more urbanized, it's going to be the same way. So Panasonic has found a way to turn its declining consumer electronics story into a sort of an illustrative example of how you can become sort of an example for the future where countries other than Japan can also use technology in a different way to see, maximize the efficiency of the expertise they already have and turn it into, you know, new growth areas. So I think that's something that Japanese corporations need to step up a bit on. It's not so much a declining story of the industries they've been in for the last 50 years, but what they can use that expertise for in the future in new industries, in robotics, in energy, to show other countries how it's done, basically.
Thank you. So it sounds like from what the panelists are saying here that the elements of the story are certainly there. It's really about the actual process of how we communicate that story. Going to Fiona's point, as a person who runs a PR company, 2 years ago, Japanese companies were about 5% of my overall revenue. Now they're 40%. And the majority of that is them coming to us for advice as to how they frame their story overseas. They're very conscious of the fact that they have 120 years or so, say, history in Japan. Everyone knows their products. They go to a market like Indonesia and no one even knows how to pronounce their name. And so they're very conscious of the fact. And more recently, over the past 3 months, we see a lot of inquiries coming to us from the head offices of these companies asking us how they can construct a global communications platform. So at least they understanding what the questions are, maybe not the answers. So the elements of the story there, it's all about the communication. Tamsin, can you think of any examples recently where Japan has done a good job of telling its story?
Absolutely. I mean, I think if you look at the three arrows of Abenomics, I think the first and second arrows have been communicated in an incredibly slick and on-message, disciplined fashion, and have made a huge impact in markets and the media, clearly. Especially Corodenomics, I think, in particular, has been brilliantly communicated. I think on the third arrow, as you were saying, Ono-san, I think that, I mean, of course, the nature of it makes it far harder to communicate. I mean, firstly, because a lot of what the third arrow contains is quite politically difficult domestically. So who wants to shout about labour market reform, for instance? But even having said that, I think that on the third arrow, there are too many initiatives, too much detail, and even with a very sort of full and complex contents, there's been very little attempt to explain the importance of the white collar exemption legislation, for instance, that's coming. If you talk to people overseas, they've barely even heard of it, but it's really important. So, fantastic marks on first and second arrow. Third arrow, I think you could do a lot more. On the other hand, I mean, there is one part of the third arrow, again, which has been brilliantly communicated, and that's womenomics, I think. I think, due to the nature of the LDP and also even, past statements, involvements of the Prime Minister, there was a lot of scepticism surrounding the subject of empowerment of women in the Japanese economy. And I think that and again, it is really the Prime Minister's actions, going to conferences, talking about this again and again in international forums at Davos. I think that has been one of the most huge successes of the third arrow. And it's a very popular message at home and overseas. And on the message, the message, what should Japan's story be coming up to 2020? All the elements are there, and one key message has to be openness, I think. And it's quite clear that the Prime Minister and his team are completely on top of this. At our Economist Summit in the spring, the Prime Minister stated very clearly that Japan needs to shed the inward-looking focus that it has had and embrace outsiders, get to grips with globalization. And I think that's a really key message that's already been communicated.
I'd like to develop that a little bit more. As journalists, what do you think Japan can do in terms of process, really, to communicate better with you and your publications? What are the impediments that are there, and how can we sort of find a way of getting over those? And perhaps, Adrian, if you could jump in with the way that other countries around the world do this. Is there anything that we can suggest to Japan that would be a better way for them to communicate in terms of the process?
I think, as Tamsin said, I think Japan's to be commended for really getting it together in terms of presenting a very coherent and very easily digestible scheme of government. I think just the fact there are three arrows is a huge help to people to understanding exactly what it is that the Japanese government is trying to do. So on the one hand, I think they've made huge strides in going forward. I think the Prime Minister, you've got a charismatic and news-making leader who really can create a headline almost anywhere he goes. I think, though, in terms of the organization, Japan's probably in a very similar situation to a lot of other democratic countries where you have an organized press corps around the leadership that's also very inward-looking and very narrowly focused. And I think, you see that in the UK, for example, with the lobby system. You certainly see it with the White House press corps in the United States. I don't think it's something that's just restricted to Japan's press club system that grew up in the post-war era. I think it's something for all, Western leaderships, that they actually need to think about getting the story out beyond that very horse race focused, very kind of point scory, who's up, who's down sort of reporting that characterizes almost every single political kind of insider reporting style from Westminster to the White House to here in Japan. So I think perhaps looking at how they can go beyond that, how they can globalize it in terms of both language, in terms of both equalizing the playing field for global media to allow them to help to tell that story and also to help to hold Japan to account on that story. I think those are two important things that they ought to be thinking about. And again, that goes to some of the issues we're talking about. If Japan wants to say it's open to the world and to global scrutiny and to global interest, then it has to demonstrate, I think, a willingness to offer that on a level playing field. So I think that's one key change potentially.
I have an example to add to Adrian's point. You know, the Imperial Household Agency recently came up out and disclosed the 12,000-page documents in the Showa era, the Showa Emperor. And it took 24 years to compile this information. They finally came out with it. They're going to publicize it. So what does it do? It releases the documents only to the reporters in the press club and not to people like us in the foreign media. Well, that's a shame because, you know, we also would be interested in seeing what's inside the 24 years of research. And there is a way to take a look at it as, you know, a member of the general public, which is to line up outside the palace. But there's only a handful of people who are allowed in every day to view these documents, and you can't take copies or anything. And each person is limited to just 15 minutes to view the 12,000 pages. So that's, you gotta be a fast reader to take in all that information. And, you know, that's kind of, it could be, there may not be anything to it except for the fact that it's always been done this way, but it's an awful shame to, you know, do it in a situation like this when there'll be more people than just, you know, people, reporters in the press club who might be interested in taking a look. So I would propose that, you know, disclosure, even in areas that people may not be thinking of, there are more instances where more disclosure, you know, may be a good thing.
Great. Fiona.
Yeah, I would just add that actually another aspect to this excess of information is the time that Japanese companies, which is the people I usually interview, the time they take to answer questions. And I've worked with companies around the region, and you know, even in countries that are not as developed as Japan, the internet access or the access to each company's top brass seems to be a lot faster than you can get in Japan. So for instance, the other day I was working on a chapter for a book about the aging population. So obviously I wanted to ask Japanese companies how they dealt with it. And I spoke to a few of them, and granted it was Obon, so like last month there were some people going on holiday, but they gave me dates to interview their executives that were 2 weeks in advance of what 2 weeks later than what I had asked for. And I said, oh, I can't do it in that week. And then they gave me another date that was the next month. And the sense of urgency I feel in Japanese companies communicating whatever they have to say to the public isn't as acute as you can see in most other in other countries around the world. And that also limits access, because by the time you actually speak to them, the news is over. Basically, we've moved on to the very fast news cycle that we have. So that's something I think that maybe should be looked at as well, not just from the government, but individual companies' perspective.
Speed reading and more speed. Speed seems to be becoming a Tamsin, do you have something to add on the issue of how can Japan do it better?
I really just would second Fiona's point about companies and speed of response. I think there's a huge opportunity for the public relations profession and just going in there and revolutionizing the way they communicate, and that would also tell Japan's story far more effectively, because of course at the heart of Abenomics is what companies are doing, where they're investing, why they're not putting wages up, why Japanese companies are expanding overseas instead of at home. So I think it's absolutely crucial that they communicate that far in a far more direct way.
I think one of the issues on that side has been perhaps the lack of professional communication skills or PR skills, both in the corporate and perhaps the government sector as well. Public relations is not taught at many Japanese universities. Marketing or journalism is, but not public relations. Unfortunately, the public relations departments in many companies tend to be the place where unsuccessful salesmen are placed. And we know from the government that there are regular rotations, which means that the bank of knowledge and the skill sets really don't grow. One of my personal always proposals is Japan is one of, I think, the very few countries in the world where the cabinet secretary actually fronts the press conferences. Now, the Cabinet Secretary has a day job. He's a very busy man, and yet he's got to do 2 press conferences a day. How much depth can he actually go into? It may be true that there may be ongoing briefings with the press club later. But the other thing is, it's a much more complex journalistic world out there now. The cycle is much faster. The journalists themselves need to be understood better on perhaps a more individual basis. And so you need professionals who are used to working with journalists, used to helping shape those news stories and have a more professional and skilled approach, I think. And unfortunately, the Cabinet Secretary is, I'm sure, a very intelligent and smart person, but he does have limited time. Most countries in the world have professionals in those positions. Would any of you like to sort of make a comment on that?
I would just like to add to that. There is a fabulous unofficial spokesman for the Kante, which is Taniguchi-san, Taniguchi Tomohiko. And I would just like to mention that he's absolutely superb. And in terms of offering an opinionated, frank, and entirely sort of spin-free version of what's going on in the Prime Minister's team, I think he's unrivaled. And I think much of the foreign press remarks on how unique that is, actually, and it gives so much value to the communications you do get. Taniguchi-san is a former journalist and also expert on national security. So just wanted to flag up his excellence.
Yeah, speaking from a communications standpoint, I don't know if I'd urge for necessarily the employment of more communications people. I think the opportunity that the digital sort of revolution that we've experienced in the last 10 years offers is actually for people at all levels to communicate more effectively and more freely. And I think actually what you need is a process that facilitates that actually. And that's more dynamic and more authentic than I think having people represent your opinion. I mean, that's certainly what we've tried to do at the forum, is actually just get people out there, get a voice out there, and get different people speaking on subjects which they actually know about, which carries a little bit more weight than someone like me representing their opinion. I think that's where you need a cultural change, where you need the confidence to allow people to express those opinions because they might not be coming from a central script, and where you also need to impress on people the need to be out there and having their voices heard. And I think if you, for example, look at the world of economics and how much that's changed in the last 10 years, one of the world's leading economists is now a blogger, Twitter enthusiast and columnist, as opposed to being a full-time professor, which is Paul Krugman. If you look at people like Robert Reich, Joseph Stiglitz, I could keep going with people like Tyler Cowen, Scott Sumner. I mean, there are 20 or 30 different voices from the econosphere debating very important policy issues now in the open in ways that before were held behind closed doors. Now, where are the Japanese voices adding to that conversation? They're the kind of places where I think it would be great to have extra dimensions, and not just in the econosphere, but in the security space and in a whole range of other global conversations. So I would be an advocate of empowering more people, not just empowering them, but encouraging them to take up their voices and make themselves heard.
One thing that we might all want to think about is not limit those voices to, Japanese people. And there are lots of non-Japanese people, too, who could speak about Japan and various Japanese issues. But there seems to be this sense that even now that only Japanese people can speak about Japan. And if that's changed, that might also open up some possibilities.
I agree with you entirely. As a PR person, third-party validation is much more powerful than having you tell your own story. And so perhaps having a book written by foreigners who are living in Japan about how wonderful Japan is and how great the society is might be a better way of doing it than Japan publishing a book by itself, generally.
Can I just jump in and say, I think if you look at, for example, where China is, then I think definitely the China story benefits from having some of the key university professors. I'm thinking of people like Michael Pettis, who've actually helped communicate some of the changes economically that are going on in China from not an uncritical point of view, but really helped interpret it to a wider audience. And I think that it's a great case for saying there's a massive added value from bringing people from the outside into your sort of institutional framework to act as interpreters and also proselytizers for what you're wanting to get across.
Tamsin?
I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I do just want to bring us back to the substance of the story, and again just reiterate that in Abenomics and the return of Abe-san really from the political dead to confound everyone's expectations, to wrest his party, the LDP, in the direction of reform rather than the old-fashioned public work spending, etc., etc. It's an incredible story, and in a way, yes, you need great communicators to get it across, but the facts will speak for themselves if it works. And so the story leading up to 2020, I mean, it really could go either way. It could be a story of economic revival, greater openness, overcoming the tragedy of 3/11. But we're at the moment poised where that story could go wrong. And I think what really counts is making the effort to keep Abenomics on track. And I mean, the alternative, I mean, we're talking about the positive side, and again, we all hope that will continue, but the story could go very wrong if Abenomics fails. I mean, the investment banks don't say this in public, of course, but behind closed doors, they will say that there's no smooth way out of Abenomics. It could be, things could get quite volatile in markets if Abenomics doesn't work. So just wanted to bring us back to the substance. Let's keep Abenomics on track, which means more third arrow and more corrodonomics and so on and so forth.
One point I want to add to the point that as Japan becomes more talked about, higher level of interest, more spokespeople perhaps for Japan, there will also be people looking at, wow, Japan does things very differently from the rest of the world or from the US or other Western nations. And there's a handout that you all have on a story in the Wall Street Journal recently about baseball. And it's kind of an unusual story for the journal to do, but it shows that just how differently Japan plays baseball compared to the US. And it's about high school baseball, an area where in the US they have these rules against one person pitching too often because it might lead to injuries. And that is not the case in Japan, where the role of the high school baseball team pitcher is to, do one for the team, even if it might lead to injuries down the road or whatever. There's supposed to be, sort of a self-sacrificing mentality of, when it comes to crunch time, then you got to be out there pitching, even if you just pitched the day before. In practice, also, there's this notion that, pitch to drop kind of thing. So you have to really practice hard, and that shows how serious you are about contributing to the team. Now, there was a high school student who questioned this and wanted to do it the US way of resting for a few days before making his next pitch. But that was something that he and his father did on their own, versus it wasn't the coach who said, for the longevity of my, to extend the life as a pitcher of my student, I want this new rule imposed. It was really this student's personal idea and personal mission to whether or not he could continue this, which was looked upon quite critically from the rest of Japan. So something like that resonated a lot with the US audience. There were a lot of people commenting or following the story, which just goes to show that as Japan becomes more noticed in the rest of the world, it might want to consider that there will be times when this could come as a surprise to Japan that, I didn't know that the rest of the world, cared so much about how often the high school pitchers played. But it is a big difference, and it's very symbolic of, some of the things that Japan does differently. And that's just something that Japan has to be aware of and tackle going forward.
Yeah, I think at the same time, I read the story, and I think it was a really riveting aspect of how Japanese culture is the same but a bit different also from America and other countries around the world. I mean, baseball obviously is a very specific aspect of that. But what struck me about the story was that the Japanese students were not so different from the Americans in terms of, wanting to do their best, but also wanting the best for themselves, not just for the team. And as I speak to people who read stories about Japan, I feel that one thing they often say is Japan brings itself across as being very special, very unique. And while there's a lot of good reason to do that, they are obviously, very, very different in many ways. There needs to be more of a sense that Japan is not weird and wacky all the time, but it's different in leading the rest of the world in ways they can understand. So maybe fewer of these stories about how Japan is doesn't have enough sex, for instance, and more of, how Japan is doing well in areas that other countries also want to do well in, and how to get there. I think maybe a bit more minimization of the difference in Japan in terms of them being particularly strange.
One of the most brilliant stories, I don't know if anyone remembers from the World Cup, was a story about Japanese football fans. And sorry, I'm going to call it football and not soccer. Because that's what it's called. Amidst all the stories of sporting success, the Japanese fans stayed behind to clear up the stadium. And I think that resonates hugely with people as being like a wonderful example of collective behavior in a positive, really touching way. And I think, things like that tell you so much about societies and about values in a way in which all the kind of spokespeople and all the Twitter accounts can't do. And I think, too, they are a reminder that there are a lot of positive equilibria in Japanese society that could probably influence in a good way a lot of behaviors around the world. And I think sort of passing some of those out and sharing them is actually something that would be of great interest and great benefit. In the same way that just one of my favorite economics articles is Paul Krugman on positive equilibria, and the example he chooses is British food, which he points out is among the worst things imaginable until the 1970s. But the thing about it was very, it was across all society. However rich you were, you still got bad food. And how this kind of changed is his version of how you can go from a bad equilibria to a good equilibria. And I think there are examples in Japan's society where there are positive equilibria that could be meaningfully and interestingly shared with the rest of the world to all of our advantage.
I think that's true. I'm a long-termer in Japan, and when I ask people that have been similarly long-term in Japan what they think the Japan story should be, it's always things like how Japan gets its trains to run on time, or how they can have a society in a very crowded city like Tokyo where there's very limited crime, or a lot of things that are more about the values of the culture than the culture itself or the values of society. And Japan doesn't really do a very good job of promoting that part of its culture. It tends to talk about ikebana or the beauty of Japan rather than those more intrinsic, perhaps, societal values that we have. We're coming into question time in 10 minutes, but I'd just like to come back to something that we mentioned in the beginning of the session. We've talked a lot about the role of Abe-san as the spokesperson and the need for Abenomics to continue in order to keep the story going. Is there a Japan story without Abe-san and Abenomics? And if there is, what should it be? Yumiko.
Well, there's got to be a Japan story without Abe-san, right? I mean, eventually he's... And it's got to be, think about all the... Somebody talked about Japan being a lab experiment for the elderly, but... it is indeed a lab experiment and could be something that the rest of the world looks at, and how it tackles, could there be economic growth in a country where the population is declining? I mean, that's a question that everybody wants to know the answer to. And with or without Abe-san, Japan could be the story and the country showing all the examples. That's just one. Whether Japan could tackle deflation and overcome it. I mean, that's another issue that with or without Abe-san, the rest of the world's going to be interested in. So there are lots of ways in which Japan is already, whatever happens politically, it's going to be of interest to the rest of the world.
Adrian?
Yeah, I think for Japan to be a story without the Prime Minister, I think it has to develop an interest in telling its story. And I think that's something which is still out there as, I think there are a lot of untold stories about Japan that it needs to settle on itself. If you look at, for example, an economy that has, a great potential comparative value. I mean, look at Germany and how it's dealt with its reinvention in the latter half of the 20th century, and a very different way, I think, from Japan in terms of really rebuilding itself from the bottom. And I think as Japan goes forward, I mean, telling your story also means coming to terms with your history. And I think, the history also involves trust. And I think rebuilding that trust regionally is going to be important. And I think, it requires a story or at least a willingness to grapple with that story in a meaningful and engaged way. And Japan's not alone in this. I mean, if you look at what you've seen in Ferguson in the US recently, the United States has exactly the same problem with its refusal as a society to really still get to grips with an issue like slavery. In Britain, we're still kind of held back by our polite refusal to remember that we were a colonial power for 2 or 3 centuries. So it's not unique, but I do think as countries move forward and as societies move forward, they also have to look back in a critical and engaged way that demonstrates something about their own authenticity. So that would be my thoughts on it.
Adrian said an interesting comment. He said that Japan has to have more interest in telling its story and be more willing to tell a story. Tamsin, do you perceive that Japan doesn't really have interest in telling its story? Is that an issue?
I think that there's a huge interest in getting across this this cultural difference, and I completely agree that it's really undercovered, under-communicated. I've been in Tokyo for a year and a half, and I've found it extraordinary to see some of these positive equilibria. I mean, certainly as a woman, the fact that you could walk home at 1 a.m. without feeling any nervousness. I mean, that's just an extraordinary thing. And yet, of course, most of the coverage focuses on the difficulties for women in society. So there are a lot of things, and I think the Cool Japan initiative is very interesting and formerly led by Inada-san. And again, I think there's a new sort of wisdom about how to pursue that agenda. For instance, I think one of the other positive equilibria is, without wanting to lower the tone of the conversation, Japanese lose. And Inada-san says, let's not just focus on what Japan thinks is cool about Japan, but what foreigners think. And one of those things is Toto. There's no doubt about it. So I think a lot more communication of those social elements would be fantastic. And just on the question of whether there's a great story without Shinzo Abe, I think just from a political point of view, I think many people, although no one's talking about this yet because the poll ratings are still extremely high, but I think there's a widespread view that if it's not Abe, then it has to be another reformer, whoever that would be from within the LDP. So the first thing, we hope Abenomics will succeed. Number 2 thing, we hope that a successor, if there has to be one at some point, will be equally committed to reform and that the story remains intact.
More of a reform story than an Abe story, or a...
For me and for the the people who are passionate about reform in this country, those two things are synonymous.
Right. Fiona.
Right. I think one of the reasons Abe has dominated the Japan story for so long is because of, well, one of the quotes I read recently in a book about Japan, which is that Japan has many good soldiers, but not so many good commanders. And Abe has been a very good channel to bring the story of Japan into the world in a way that the rest of the world understands. But obviously, as I think some people have mentioned already, not everybody agrees with everything that Abe is saying. So, Japan's story has to be more than just about Abe. There are lots of other viewpoints about how Japan interacts with the world economically, in terms of national security. And even if Abe is not around, somebody else will have to step up to bring Japan's story to the world. And it can be anybody from Japan or without Japan, in just understanding that there are many, many different viewpoints, and it's not just what Abe says that the entire country believes in or, really goes in the same direction. So definitely I think there is a story without Abe.
I'd like to ask the journalists on the panel, if Harry Potter appeared in front of you and said, I'm going to wave my magic wand and you are going to be able to have your perfect interview. You can do it with anyone about anything you want, as long as it's in relation to Japan. What would it be? Yumiko.
Wow. That's a very creative question. Because we've talked a lot about Abe-san, but of course we want to talk more to him, but we've also said that he said enough, right? Basically. So, boy, I would love to talk to whoever the next Abe-san's going to be. And for Harry Potter to show us who that is as well.
Why not Emperor
Showa? Emperor Showa and what he's really thinking. Yeah, I mean, surely Harry Potter can do that for us, right?
Sure he could.
That's a great idea.
I'm sure he could. Fiona? Your perfect story.
Well, I think it would be people I don't even know exist in Japan, and people, who are maybe in the rural areas whose voices are not heard. And I don't even know which name to say because I don't know much about them. But I think it's a story that hasn't really been covered. Everybody's moving to Tokyo. There's so much interest in the Tokyo Olympics, and the rural areas are emptying out. I'd like to see, what the story is there and how to see the future.
Great.
I'd like to sit down with Xi Jinping, I think, and just figure out whether he's going to say yes to a meeting in November for a start, and whether he's going to maybe ramp down the violent war dramas which always portray Japan in a terrible light. I think it has a big influence on public opinion in China, and just what his security thoughts are.
Interesting. Adrian, if you were a journalist.
I was just going to say, I've never been gladder not to be a journalist anymore, listening to those. I was actually going to say it'd be fascinating, I think, to hear from the Emperor. I mean, if you're British, or as we're preparing perhaps to be Itish with the vote coming up, it was fascinating to see the Queen intervene, not directly, but indirectly this weekend in British politics. I mean, she normally stands very much above it, but she said that everyone should sort of look inside their hearts, I think it was, over the vote, which is as near as the Queen comes, I think, to shouting no. But I do think, royal families have a fascinating insight into the continuities of politics, and also into their own societies. And I think it would be fascinating to get a view from the imperial household on the continuities and challenges that they see Japan facing.
Is the new Scottish girlfriend also a political statement by the royal family? I'd like to now hand over to the audience for any questions. I think, Glenn.
Glenn Fukushima. I have an observation and a question. The observation is that I moved back to Washington, D.C. 2 years ago during the Noda government in September of 2012. At that time, the major interest in Japan was territorial disputes between Japan and China, and also the aftermath of 3/11. since the advent of the Abe government, as all of you said, economics is a major issue, national security policy is another issue, and history has become an issue. So my question is, it seems that the Japanese government is spending quite a bit of effort on trying to counter China and South Korea with regard to the history issues, whether it's comfort women or Yasukuni or whatever. As a professional journalist, do you think that this is the best use of resources and time by the Japanese government? And what would be your advice as to how the Japanese government should deal with this issue? Is it something they should ignore or launch a full-scale counterattack? Or what is the best response? Thank you.
I think we might need Harry Potter for that one. Tamsin.
If I could take that one to begin with. I think if you think about history, territorial issues, I think there's some sharp distinctions to be drawn. I mean, perhaps you could divide it into Yasukuni, which obviously hit the headlines in December, maybe comfort women, maybe territorial disputes. I think that the handling of the Yasukuni visit was actually quite restrained and dignified and, really, really well managed. And of course, it was an event that, it was something they had to talk about. Territorial disputes, again, I think the Gaiman show is incredibly expert at handling the debates and the facts and communicating that to the foreign media. Comfort women, I find more troubling. I think, and also, some of the other terrible atrocities of the Second World War. I think the problem is that there's really, it's not just about politicians here. It's about the consensus among the elite. I think there just simply is a gap between what the educated elite think about past events and what foreigners think about past events, more broadly. So what do you do about that? I mean, I think what's been happening is a tendency to want to examine the details. How many people was it at Nanjing? Were the comfort women forcibly recruited or just recruited? And, one can understand that it's important for future generations of Japanese to know exactly what happened in the past for their identity and so on. But you cannot escape from the fact that for the outside world, it looks like you're trying to undermine the gravity and horror of what happened. So I think that's the main problem. On the subject of the message coming up to 2020, I commend the LDP's efforts to deal with hate speech. I think the Tokyo governor, Matsuzoe-san, as you know, went to visit President Park Geun-hye and came back and requested to Abe-san that there be legislation on this problem. And I would very much welcome that, and it's a great step. So I think it's a mixture of handling it well, handling it badly.
Okay, next question. Shikata-san.
Norishikata with Japanese Foreign Ministry. I just came back from my assignment in London 2 months ago, and I can tell you that restaurants in London are much better these days. Actually, my question relates to the issue of initial statement about lack of Japanese voices in international media, and of course it's not really, not limited to the government, but also private sector. And I tried to ask this question to the plenary ministers, about how we could do better. Maybe the role of education is so critical, and maybe from your viewpoints, working on media or public affairs. What is your recommendation about how we could do better job? Maybe toward the 2020 Tokyo Olympics.
Anyone on the panel like to tackle that?
Well, just on education, my old job, I was a professor and I ran a journalism school in London for 5 years. And we had a fantastically diverse student body. We had something like 600 graduate students a year. We had them from China, from across Africa, from India. I don't think we had one Japanese student in 5 years. You know, we had exchanges of faculty with China, with India, with Africa, with the US. I don't think we had one communication with a Japanese university in that time about possibly sharing faculty information, conference, anything. And I think that speaks to me quite powerfully of Japan's interaction on an educational front with the rest of the world, which is we don't see enough Japanese studying abroad, and we don't see enough overseas scholars and students coming into Japan to learn about Japan. And I think there's definitely a gap there that I think could be met that would benefit all sides.
So would you suggest that the government put up money for scholarships for people who want to learn public relations or whatever messaging overseas?
Well, having run a journalism school, I'm very ambivalent about journalism education, actually. I'm certainly not sure I'd advise anyone to study those things. But I think if you think about funding for education, I think not just government, but certainly companies, institutions, exchanges, even at executive level, getting people into executive programs in business schools, those kind of exchanges are all hugely important in terms of both sharing what you've learned here in Japan and also getting some insight into Japanese culture from other outlets. So yeah, I'm not advocating on behalf of more public relations courses.
Just from a public relations perspective, just to balance that, I think there are many things that can be done to increase the number of voices, but I think at the very conceptual level, most of Japan's ministries and corporations feel an incredible need to say something, and that their job is to say something, or in some cases, say nothing. It's all about say or not say. I think there is a broader role for government agencies and also corporations to provide a platform for bringing journalists and spokespeople together. For instance, funding a tour for journalists to go to the rural areas to speak to people, to provide a platform for the journalists from around the world to be able to get access to third parties rather than having to be the master of the message themselves, I think is possibly one solution. Next question. Yes, you sir, over there.
Hi. I'd like to mention another issue. Thanks. We're talking sort of about official communications, but I think there's a level of kind of citizen, sort of grassroots, individual people communications. And my name's Carl Kay, and I'm an entrepreneur, and my newest company is a tourism company offering inbound tours for inbound visitors to Japan. And the people who, you're supposed to have a license to be a tour guide in Japan if you're presenting Japan to outsiders. And to become a tour guide, you have to, it's sort of like the high school entrance exam. You have to memorize the content of a lot of books. It's very much modeled on the same
How high
idea.
is Tokyo Tower?
Well, exactly. Things like that. I mean, like sort of the names of all the onsen areas in Japan, and these are all good things to know. I'm not saying that's bad information, but what we're trying to do is find deep experts who are able to communicate with their enthusiasm and their passion and their deep knowledge and experience, wonderful, wonderful riches of life in many aspects of life in Japan, and especially in Tokyo. And it's really frustrating that those people are not allowed to do that according to the law. And we're trying to figure out how to kind of work with that and around that. And it's quite this idea of controlling the message, which has come up in a lot of areas, and in the cross-cultural studies, Hofstede's cultural indices is sort of the leading measure of culture. Japan is sort of outlier high on avoiding uncertainty. It's you know, you measure all the countries in the world by this index, and Japan is just way out there in the upper right on outlying, avoiding uncertainty and this controlling of the message. And, you know, to tell people in Akihabara that you can't wear costumes when you're giving tours because that creates a public nuisance is really seems crazy to me, because that's the charm of Akihabara. And Japan has so many wonderful things to offer, and you're saying no because I don't know why, I guess, but this need to control the message. So I think it happens both at the very high levels, but you can see it, you know, filtering down in many ways.
Thank you. That's a very interesting comment, and I think maybe you will address it in your session later. So there's a gentleman just over there who's been putting up his hand.
Yeah. I wanted to congratulate Tamsin that she finally talked about the real issues of Japan's picture outside the world. We have talked about Abenomics and economics and culture and all of this. I will not dispute that this is not important. I was myself a sensei at Todai. But the real issue is the foreign relationship of Japan with the rest of the world and security. And the elephant in the room is clearly China. And the world of Japan still looks at Washington, even making reference to some baseball. I mean, with all due respect, that's not the issue. And I want to refer back to you. The Financial Times, like many other newspapers over the last week, has reported on a new survey which showed that more than 90% of the Japanese look down, if not to say hate, China. And the Chinese return with a somehow similar result. 80% of the Chinese look down on Japan. Now, I think that's a major issue. Where this comes from in China is, I think, pretty clear. I live in China, I should say. Right? I wanted to ask the journalist here, what is the role of the media in this negative view which the Japanese have on China?
Anyone?
I think that might be a question for
Yeah.
domestic media than us, perhaps.
I think so. It's probably a question more for the domestic media rather than the international media.
Or is there a taboo here in the room?
No, there's no taboo in the room. Does anyone want to handle it?
Well, to dive in, I mean, I think the question of Japan's history in the region is a vital one for it to address. But I mean, the rise of China is obviously one of the key issues facing Japan, which is one of those laboratory issues we talked about at the very beginning, which is to say that, you know, it's having to confront China as an immediate neighbor with the whole issue of the South China Sea. If you look in Davos, the headline in Davos was the Prime Minister talking about the tensions in the South China Sea and actually dramatizing them in a way by, you know, comparing it to 100 years ago and suggesting that this was something the world ought to take very seriously. And I mean, I think the world does take the South China Sea extremely seriously. But in terms of communication, in terms of dialogue, then, you know, you have to put that China story into the global story. And it's a more difficult interaction to manage, as you know, because China is not an open society in the way that, for example, Japan is. And it's a much more managed environment. And right now it's undergoing its own very profound changes, which are having an impact across society and actually, at the moment, I think, adding to a layer of confusion potentially and nervousness amongst people in China. But I think we've already said that China has a lot to offer in terms of examples of how it's expanded its global influence and image in terms of people like the Jack Ma's and its champions in different spheres beyond politics, and also in its interaction with other institutions, both educationally and in other ways, and by bringing people in from the outside, like yourself, Helmut, who can act as both advocates, proselytizers, and interpreters to the rest of the world of China's experience. You know, I mean, you can speak to us with your experience of China. Now, perhaps that might be of relevance to people here in Japan, thinking about having helmets of their own who can act for Japan.
I mean, just to add to that, I mean, I think this subject, what should Japan's story be? I mean, it's all the more important in view of mean, China has really stepped up a coordinated public relations campaign, quite a successful one recently. I mean, after the Asakuni visit, of course, I think there were about 30 editorials written by China's ambassadors all around the world in the global media. So there's no doubt that there's even more need for successful communication to counter that or to meet it.
Well, I actually just wanted to bring it maybe to Southeast Asia, where there's also disputes with China. And it's a region that has tried, ASEAN as a whole has tried to sort of mediate sometimes between China and Japan. And I think that what we see from Southeast Asian perspective is that both sides are telling a story without really seeing the other side of the story. And I think that some of the empathy may be missing over there. And, you know, in telling your story, your side of the story, there needs to be a sense of how it's going to be received, and maybe some idea of how to put that across without coming across as being too abrasive or being too one-sided is very important in both, not just in Japanese media in China and Chinese media in Japan, but also in the rest of the world, in areas that are caught in between maybe or are trying to help the situation.
Do you want to follow up a comment on this or a new question?
Sure. I'm Nancy Snow. We'll be continuing this conversation, Ambassador Kondo and myself, talking about promoting Japanese culture in the world. But 20 years ago, I worked for a propaganda agency called the United States Information Agency. So I guess I'm still a propagandist. And you know, we've got to get over sort of our feelings of reversion about propaganda. I've lived in China. I've taught at Tsinghua University. When I arrived the very first day, the dean, who was the host of the journalism school there, turned to me and said, "Next week we will fly to Qingdao and you will give talks to government officials on media relations." And they utilized me from day one to be a cultural informant, a media relations informant, a persuasion expert. They were very smart about utilizing their international visitors. Here in Japan, I have to go out and get in touch with people and tell them, hey, I'm here, and guess what? I have something to share, but I'm also here to help you tell your story. So thank you for the title for my book, because I think it's going to be telling a Japan story to the world. And I couldn't be more excited about living in Japan than right now. I think there's a lack of passion in the storytelling, and it can't come from the top down. It has to be beyond Abe, and everybody in this room has a story to share about Japan and also its global role. It's so critical. So
you'd agree that there's a role for the provision of a platform to bring all those things together?
There is indeed, but I think you really need to utilize the gaijin, the ones who are here. I don't speak Japanese, but I don't let that hinder me. I plan to learn it a little bit, but more than that, it is the enthusiasm that we have, and we're the observers. We can be a little bit more objective, a little bit more critical. But one thing I wanted to add about the Japanese, that often they tell me, we are not good at promotion. So you have to kind of flip that over. What you're really good at, what I see is active listening, which is a really key part of good public diplomacy. I talk way too much, but there's a reason. There's a reason why we have 2 ears to 1 mouth. And we have to
Nancy.
really think about that.
Thank you. One last question. Thank you.
My name is Maiko Tajima. I'm from the United Nations World Food Program. My question is about the Abenomics. One of the most popular themes downstairs this morning was the gender ratio in a new cabinet. And then in my eyes, this panel has the highest gender ratio for women of the day. Yeah. So my question is to you, the female experts in here, is what could be changed? What could be improved if we want to empower women and then bring women back to the workforce? Probably with some little reflection on your own career development process. Thank you.
Okay, we have about 1 minute left. Would someone like to pick up on that?
I mean, all the things that was talked about this morning and more. I mean, as Tamsin said, you know, the Prime Minister's done a fantastic job of just saying women, 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 and perhaps too ambitious target maybe, but it gets the word out there that Japan is serious about promoting women. Companies, of course, have to do more in promoting women to real positions, not just positions with titles and nobody to manage. For the women themselves, there could be a lot more kind of self-confidence building, coaching, kind of the mentoring that may or may not have existed before, but is clearly necessary. So all of the things that are talked about and more just has to be done. But, I'm sure that now that people are thinking about it, a lot more could be done now than when this wasn't even a public issue.
Sorry, can I just jump in here? I just want to say that a lot of it has to do with the mindset of Japanese women themselves. And, Abe is promoting all this Abenomics, but nothing has really changed on the ground. My husband works in a Japanese law firm, and the secretaries, a lot of them are from really good universities, Waseda, Keio. These are not, admin assistants. They are really competent, highly educated women, but they have not much intention of staying on in the workforce after they get married and they have kids. And this is something I feel is quite unique to Japan, maybe some other countries like Korea, but you don't really see it even in other Asian countries. And despite that, there are more women now in Japan's cabinet than in Singapore's, and I think in many other countries around the world. And that's a good start, but it has to start from the bottom as well. Each individual woman has to believe that, they want to work, they want to continue contributing to the economy, and I think that's really what has to change.
Adrian, the last word.
Super quickly, can I just say my mother was the breadwinner in our family, and she worked in education, and her mother before her got her break as a woman with a career in education. And I think there are some very obvious and very good examples of places where women can be allowed to be successful. Education is actually one of those sectors, and we're very dismissive often of education. It's been bloody good at getting women into powerful and important positions. I think we should take a damn good look at some of the sectors where women have been successful and learn from those sectors.
Just very briefly, we're running out of time, but just two practical things matter more than anything. Working hours, try and change the corporate culture on working hours. Well, three practical things. Change the tax system so that you don't encourage married women to limit their working hours, and that's something that the Prime Minister is trying to do. And the other thing is change the immigration law so that Japanese women, not just foreign women like me, can hire proper childcare in the home that can take care of other duties like caring for the elderly.
Thank you. I hope this session was of use to you. Please thank my panelists, Yumiko, Adrian, Fiona, and Tamsin.